started the grassroots communist movement, having gone through the long march, crossing the Chinese countryside, gathering grassroots support for the revolution, particularly by gathering support at peasant level in villages in rural China. He then founded a base in Yan'an, which you can see in this poster, in the northwest of China. So, I mean, there are lots of themes. Here you can see one which is based on industry, and there were there were posters which were trying to promote the model. There were model communes set up for industry and agriculture. The model commune for industry was Daqing. And many of these posters were available to buy at the Xinhua bookstore, which was the main bookstore of each town or city. And they were available for very, very small prices. So often the price, which I'll show you on another poster, would be something like 0.07 yuan, so sort of less than 1 penny. And therefore they were completely affordable to buy, you know, for the mass. And you can see the kind of extreme use of graphics for the fist, which forms the main part of the sort of main dynamic of the picture. And I think this one in some ways relates to modernism and other posters going through the 20th century in different cultures, not only in China. But it's the Down with the Soviet Revisionists relates to China's falling out with the Soviet Union in the late 50s, and then again in the 60s, reiterating that. He's kind of raised up as almost like a godlike figure in the sky. The workers are holding Mao's quotation, books of Mao's quotations, and this became the use of the little red book, which you can see in one of the third one to the left, becomes the kind of tool through which the Mao cult is spread. And it's got a sort of slight charm of its own. You can see underneath is this sort of strange rocket going through with a photograph of one of the large halls of one of the congressional meetings. And then in each little medallion there's an actual acting or theatre troupe would go around, and they would actually travel around the countryside doing little performances at a local level in the villages. And they would come along, set up their equipment and have a very crude stage, and everyone would sort of carry the little wooden chairs or stools to go and sit down, and often in very, very sort of impoverished conditions. So, you know, often there was hardly any, there would be villages with no electricity, for example. Babies are often about health and hygiene, making sure, you know, the message of kind of hygiene, having enough to eat, being clean, was instilled into people, especially in the countryside, because one of the big challenges in the 50s was to try and modernise, you know, what were genuinely very sort of backward conditions in the countryside. Between Soviet art into China. China received lots of influence from the Soviet model, and particularly in socialist realism in art. And this actually says that Russia's today is our tomorrow. So it's actually transferred to be displayed through their national costume, because they are actually ethnically and linguistically kind of separate, in the sense that, you know, they have their own language, they have their own customs, they have their own culture, and yet they all are regionally under one. And there were lots of factions and street fighting and sort of chaotic scenes, but the schools and the universities and all the academies, the art academies, all closed down. Authority was completely thrown out. All the teachers were subjected to torture, humiliation. So these were the kind of posters that came out of that period, very much typical, red, black and white ones. The worker, soldier, peasant figures holding up Mao's quotations, so it's a very sort of typical. And as I say, Mao's figure, which, Mao was already a figure who appeared in lots of paintings and was seen in scenes of things like being in texts. There's a Christ figure there as well. So it's all religion, Confucianism, and anything related to what was called bourgeois or feudalism. When the influx of people from into Hong Kong came about, there was incredibly sort of crowded, difficult conditions, and people lived in tiny spaces in these huge apartment blocks with very, very tiny, just 1 or 2 rooms to live in. So it's quite interesting thinking about the situation of Hong Kong during that time. These are real people, which the stories would be disseminated in the press, so everyone would read the stories in the newspaper, and then the poster would be made to kind of show visitors and models. So the imagery becomes politicised. That's the problem, and therefore you think it hasn't got Chinese elements. Actually, it has. It's got a fusion of that with the political. So interesting. It's quite a complex, because the Westernisation had already occurred over about so there's 100 years really of Westernisation, which becomes very fused into the Chinese tradition, and you can't ever really sort of untangle them completely. That's why it becomes quite difficult to do think. Although it was absolutely stamped out the idea of capitalism, there's a price on each of those posters, and you could buy them in a shop. I mean, there's elements where there was a consumer element in the poster, which is quite interesting. But of course, all the other values were kind of deliberately taken out of it. But as soon as the Xiaoping brought reforms in, it was avidly taken up. And now you could argue it's gone the other way, to the point where even if you take your children to a playground in China, you have to pay for every single ride. You can't do anything for free. It just doesn't exist. In China, everything has to be paid for, and that's also quite shocking, because it's completely reversed. And I do find that quite unbelievable.